Please welcome Inger Lise Nerland.
Thank you, Molly. I'm just going to put out some things here. Is this working? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Molly, for the introduction. I'm, as mentioned, from Norwegian Institute for Water Research, and my name is Inger Lise. Should be a title there. Yeah. I'm taking a PhD in the marine litter issue and microplastic particles, which you heard a lot about today. And we now heard also that a lot of the plastic in the ocean is actually in the form of small you But I will talk a bit more about the plastic problem in general. But you heard it before. But it will be some repetition here or some This is a graph over the plastic production worldwide, and this is from a Plastic Europe report. And you can see that it's a quite obvious trend here. The orange field is for the world in total, and the blue areas for Europe specifically. So it is just produced more and more plastic worldwide. We know that a lot of plastic ends up in the sea, and we know that as much as 90% of the marine litter might be plastic. And we also know that in some cases they have estimated the plastic all the plastic produced, that 10% ends up in the sea. And this number is of course really variable, but as much as 10% can end up in the sea. But what happens to the plastic when it enters the sea? We know that plastic degrades, but it takes a really, really long time. And for example, a plastic bottle can take as much as 450 years to degrade. And as it's been mentioning here, that it's due to UV light, to temperature, to biological activity, but it will degrade with time. And a small plastic bag can take as much as 10 to 20 years to degrade. So even though we stop with the marine littering, we will still have the problem for a long, long time, since it will last for so long. We also know that one of the most obvious problems is, of course, the entanglement. And for example, a seal can be caught into a fishing line or a fishing net, and it can drown because it has to go up to the surface to breathe once in a while. We also know that animals do ingest plastic, and when they ingest the plastic, they can either be suffocated or they can have problems with like mechanical disturbance inside their body, and they won't eat normal prey because they're filled with this plastic garbage. But a more unknown problem is the additives or the plasticizers, which you can call it, in the plastic, but also toxic substances already in the sea, which might sorb to plastic and enter the environment or into the organisms. So we know that it's a long, long list of these additives, and we know that all of these are hazardous to the environment. We don't want this in our environment. Many of you have probably heard about them, for example, brominated flame retardants, bisphenol A, PAHs, and they might be, for example, carcinogenic, or they can interrupt with the hormone systems for animals. So we know that plastic enter the ocean, and with this plastic it will also be a lot of these additives. And how how long time it takes for these to enter the ocean, we don't know. Or some studies have been done, but this will depend upon the plastic type and also the temperature around, and it's a lot of things which can affect this leakage of this plastic or these substances into the environment. And I also mentioned the other toxicants in the environment. And we know that in the water, it's a lot of environmental pollutants, which you call it. And we know that plastic has the ability to absorb things into them. So it might be the possibility that the additives or the toxicants floating around in the ocean might be transported into the animals because of this. So we also talked a lot about the microplastic particles today, and we also define this as plastic particles less than 5 millimeters big. And they are produced when larger pieces of plastic litter is broken down, and then you end up with all different forms and shapes and colors, and this will eventually, or when a plastic bag or a plastic bottle is broken down, this will happen over 450 years. So you will just get more and more of these small pieces of plastic. You also have the primary microplastic particles, which has also been talked about. But you can find this in a lot of different products, for example, in scrubs or in toothpaste. And I don't want to make any of the producers angry here, but this is just some examples of ordinary products we have in Norway which contain these microplastic particles. And the problem with these particles is that the sewage treatment plant can't handle them because they don't have small enough meshes to cope with them. But we know that we find these in the environment. So where do we find microplastic particles? And as you now have heard, we find them everywhere. We find it in the beaches all around the world. We find it in the sediment, the sea bottom, or the seafloor. And we also find it in the water, in the different layers in the water. And we also know that we find them in blue mussels, in oysters, in langoustine, or sjøkreps, which you call it in Norwegian. And we also know that we find it in fish stomachs. For example, a study in the English Channel from Lusher, they found that 1/3 of the fish in the English Channel had microplastic particles in their stomach. And we also know that we find microplastic particles in seabirds, in marine mammals. So it is a problem, or we know that we have them in our environment. But what happens to these microplastic particles as they enter an organism? Does it mean anything? And is it, if the fish ingests a microplastic particle, for example, from this one, is it just excreted? Will it just pass through the animal and then it might not be a problem? Will the animal take it up over their stomach wall, so it actually enters their flesh? And if it does, will then other animals who eats, for example, this fish, also ingest that plastic particles? And will it biomagnify, as we call it, in the food chain, like environmental pollutants do? Will it get more and more higher you get up into the environment or into the ecosystem? We don't know. So this is just an example from a study, and I will now show you a bit examples of what this actually can cause, or effects we've seen in the lab. This is not in the nature, but it's important to know what this exposure can impact, or how it can impact the animals. And we know that even the smallest marine animals ingest plastic, and this is an example of a zooplankton. And all the green area here you can see, or all the bright green, is actually microplastic particle they ingested in the lab. So we know that also they can, even the smallest one can take up plastic. And the blue picture here, you can see all the red small dots. That's actually microplastic particles stuck to the to the legs of this zooplankton, and this might affect their swimming behavior. So it might make it harder for them to swim and make them a more easy prey. Another example is this marine worm called lugworm, and this is a really important species in the marine environment because it's eaten by so many other organisms. And this study showed that when this worm was exposed to microplastic particles, it actually stopped eating, or it had a reduction in its feeding capacity, and that means that it's the fat content of the worm went down, and it ate less. Studies also shown that blue mussels exposed to microplastic particles had a strong stress response in the form of an immunological response, and also that they could take the microplastic particles into their circulation system, that it actually entered their body. This is quite controversial, and a lot of scientists don't know or don't trust these results, but it might, or some things point towards the translocation, which you call it, of microplastic particles. And then we talk about serious problems here if it's actually inside the organism's body. This is an ongoing study where they exposed oysters to microplastic particles, and they saw that their ability to reproduce was reduced, so they had less offspring. So this is just to show you that it's not only the suffocation or the drowning or the reduction in growth, but it's also more subtle things, like, for example, a problem with the reproduction. And that might have a huge consequence for the ecosystem if the species can't reproduce properly. The problem I mentioned earlier about the additives and the toxicants in the environment is shown here in a lab study. And here they exposed the fish to microplastic particles in addition to a well-known toxicant in the environment. And the toxicity of this toxicant was even worse when they added the microplastic particles. And we know that animals in the ocean, they are exposed to so many things at once. It's change in temperature, it's less food suddenly, it's toxicants, and so we have to try to make as realistic picture as we can in the lab, as the most correct concentrations, for example, and try to look at all in once, and how does this affect the animals, and not only the microplastic particles by itself. So this is now I'm going to talk about Norway in or more specific, and you might have wondered where the part about Norway was going to show up. But the reason why I will just start to talk about this now is because we know quite little, actually. But I will talk about what the little we do know today. And this is a picture of the palm of my hand, and this is just an example from a beach in the outer Osfjord where we found these small pellets. And but I'm not going to talk about the measurements in the environment. But we know that we also have this plastic problem in Norway. But this is just an introduction, sort of. So I've been talking to Geir Gabrielsen from the Polar Institute, and they are studying the northern fulmar, and that is havhest in Norwegian. And they find a lot of plastic inside these birds. And they even find a lot of plastic inside young birds in the nest. And they are just now doing studies on this, and he will later on present this. But he wanted me to tell you that they see that it's been a shift in the plastic content in their gut from more industrial products to more and more consumer products. So they see more and more plastic bags, for example, and other consumer products which you and I use every day. And they are also going to do a study where they look at the concentration of environmental pollutants in the birds when they have all this plastic in their stomachs. So we are now studying cod from the inner Ostfjord, and this is a map with the stars where you can see where we have the samples from. And it's all the way from Kirkenes to the Oslofjord. And we're right now looking into the stomachs from the Oslofjord. And we do find plastic also here. And this is just some pictures. It's not the best pictures. But this is a tweezer up there, and you can see the small particles. And the other picture here is some millimeters big. And we know that it is plastic. And it was quite obvious when we opened them. But we don't know the concentrations, we don't know how many percentages or anything yet, but we do know now that we find microplastic particles also in Atlantic cod from the Norwegian coast. And that is not a surprise, because we know that we find microplastics all around the world, so why should our cod be any cleaner? And this is a dolphin, and some weeks ago this stranded near Hvaler. And we were able to get a hold of the stomach of this dolphin, and it was quite thin when they found it. And it's a bit funny, because if you see on top of the dolphin, it's actually a snus box, a scruff box, made of plastic. So this is just to show the size of the dolphin. But it's 3 meters long, approximately. But when we... this is quite gross, sorry for that. But when we opened the stomach, we found nothing else but plastic, in addition to parasites, and no food at all, because I had prepared for getting a lot of half-digested fish or a lot of organic material, but it was nothing except from this plastic. And I brought it here today, so if you want to see, you can come up, or I can show you later on. But it's... this is a bit more clean picture. It didn't ingest the pencil here. This is just to show the size. But you can see on the left side that it's a lot of fishing net. And it just, this is how it was in the stomach. It was like just together like this in the end of the stomach of the dolphin. And on the other side you can also see some packaging strips, or yeah. But we don't know how long this plastic have been inside this dolphin. Is it 10 years? Is it from yesterday? We don't know, because plastic, it takes a lot of time for it to break down. And you can also see on the sides here that some parts have been cut off from this big piece, and you can imagine that this will eventually become smaller and smaller in its stomach. So, yeah. So that is what we know today, and you now understand that we know really little. And I'm working on this in 4 years, so I hope to get a lot of information about our Norwegian ecosystems and also effects. But this is some plans we have. I will just shortly talk about that. But we're going to expose a lot of different marine organisms to microplastic particles. And we want to do that because we want to look at, for example, barnacles. And we want to get an even better understanding of how much is actually ingested, and try to use as environmental realistic concentrations as we can. Because often all the lab exposure studies, it's quite high, the concentrations people are using. But we want to simulate the nature and how it's actually what's going out there. And we also would like to see if a zooplankton eats the plastic, will we also see that it can be transferred along the food chain, and that the fish which eat this crustacean can also have plastic inside them. In addition to that, we will also test more like subtle effects, for example, DNA damage and stuff like that, and just answer some of the questions we do have. On the other side here, we will also look into the chemical side, and we would like to look at the leakage rate of several different plastic additives into the environment with different sorts of plastic, And we will also like to do common exposure with both microplastic particles and other environmental pollutants to see if we can answer a lot of these questions. Yeah, this is my contact information and a web page where you can read more about this project, because this is, I didn't go, it was not as scientific, but I wanted you to all understand the points here. And this is our partners. We're working with a lot of different companies and universities. And last, I would like to summarize summarize my talk. So we know that a lot of the waste we find in the ocean is plastic. We know that it can take a lot of time for plastic to break down. It can take as much as 600 years for a fishing net. We know that we find microplastic particles everywhere. We look, we find it. And we also know that that it can have effects on organisms, at least in the lab. We know that. We also know that we find microplastic particles and plastic in our Norwegian organisms, in birds, in fish, or even though that's quite preliminary, but also in sea mammals. And we also know that, or the take-home message here is that it's a lot of things we don't know, but we know that the possibility for this to be a big problem is there. So I think that's my main message here, that we need to know more. So thank you for listening.